Okay, I'm Peter. I'm one of the founding engineers of Unblocked. Unblocked is essentially a context engine that brings context to your code base and allows you to ask questions about your code base. But I'm going to get into that in a little bit more detail later. I just wanted to start off by saying that I know there's a lot of hype associated with dev tools and AI today. It seems like every second week there's some new announcement for a Series A, B financing or the hottest new tool in AI. But the goal of this talk is to discuss real problems that we've been solving at Unblocked with this enabling technology. So to get started, and just to frame the conversation and set some context, at a high level, I think of software development happens in 3 phases. The first phase, gathering context, is like understanding what the problem is that you're trying to solve and gathering all the bits of information that you need to go and solve that problem. The second phase is actually writing the code. So this is what we would describe as being in flow. And I think this is where a lot of the developer tools focus their attention today. So this is like code completion, code generation, et cetera. You can think of like the cursors and the windsurfs of the world. And third phase is operating the service. So this is like your observability systems, monitoring, logging, continuous deployment, et cetera. But Unblocked is focused here, helping you get the context you need to get your job done. And we focused here based on our own personal experiences, thinking through where we spend most of our time throughout our careers. And those stages of software development are an observation based on my own personal experience and the team's shared experience. I'll just give you a little bit of background about myself. I've been building apps and services and developer tools for about 20 years now. My career started working at BlackBerry, if anyone remembers BlackBerry. That's kind of dating myself a little bit, but and then various startups in between. And then I actually moved here to the UK and worked at Accenture for a while. Finally got into banking, as you do, and then back to startups, including one where I served as the CTO here in London. And then I moved back to Vancouver. I'm originally Canadian, as I'm sure you can tell from my accent. Moved back to Vancouver and joined a company called BuddyBuild. Does anyone have heard of BuddyBuild before or know what BuddyBuild is? Yes, no? Okay, so it was a continuous integration platform that solved a particular pain point for iOS developers because deploying things to the App Store was pretty tricky. And doing that through a continuous integration flow was even harder. So that was the problem that BuddyBuild solved. We were acquired by Apple, and then we worked on Xcode, what became Xcode Cloud. The rest of the team worked at various different companies like Microsoft, AWS, GitHub, Meta, Slack, et cetera. But this is all just to say that we've worked at big and small companies and across various different engineering cultures. And what we discovered was that there was just one shared frustration no matter where you worked, big, small, different engineering cultures. And that was this. As a developer, getting the information you need is grossly inefficient. And the way you do this today is super painful. Everyone here is probably acutely familiar with the 2 ways that you would get this kind of information. The first is if you're physically co-located, you would have someone on the shoulder. That's super disruptive because that person might be in flow. You might be that person actually in flow, and someone comes and taps you on the shoulder, and then you go, oh, okay, God. So you do your research, you come back, you give that person a response. That's a lot of time lost between the 2 of you. But it's even worse if you're remote. You can imagine like asking a question in Slack. I'm sure we've all done this. And your colleague is busy or just not focused on that, and it takes a while to get a reply back. And it's even worse if the person's in a different time zone, for example. I'm not sure how many of you work across different time zones with colleagues, but it can be quite painful. To make matters worse, a lot of this information that you need to get your work done is scattered across a ton of these different systems. So it could be in Slack or Jira or Confluence. You have to go digging. I like this anecdote from a team well known for hiring talented engineers. It's one of our customers. It took his most senior engineer 5 days to write 12 lines of code. So that seems a little extreme. In reality, it took way less time to actually write the code, but as soon as he knew what to write. So the real problem there was it was this kind of Heisenberg bug that, when you look at it, it disappears. So he had to go searching to figure out what was causing the issue, and then once he figured that out, he had to go and figure out if his fix was going to have some sort of cascading impact causing other failures. So the research process took a really long time. He went back around again and used Unblocked to figure this out, and it took him about 10 minutes. But this story isn't unique. Every year, Stack Overflow releases a survey, and their survey for 25 is coming out soon. But in 24, they had 65,000 respondents. They discovered that 53% agree that they were slowed down waiting on answers. So these are people that are asking questions, typically like the junior engineers or the new employees. 63% said that they spent between 30 minutes and 2 hours every day searching for answers. So this is like the spelunking through all of their documentation systems. And 50%, and this is the real biter here, are the people that are responding to questions. So these are the senior engineers on your team. And that's a lot of very valuable time lost. So I thought that maybe we could see this in action. This is how I'm going to show you how Unblocked works. And Unblocked augments source code with data from all of these systems, like things like Slack, Confluence, Jira, Notion, etc. So I'm going to show you 3 different clients. We have a web dashboard, an IDE plugin for VS Code and JetBrains IDE suites of products, and a Slack integration. I'm also going to give you a sneak peek of a feature that we're releasing very soon. And if we have some time, I'll show you a little bonus thing. So at this point, I'm going to try to figure out how to switch the screen back to mirroring mode here. Whoops, that was not it clearly. Okay. Good. All right. So this is the web dashboard for Unblocked. I'm going to ask a question that relates to our own component called the SourceMark engine. The SourceMark engine essentially is a thing that tracks changes through code and through files over time. So I asked this question, since this is a developer crowd, I usually give this presentation to managers, team leaders kind of thing, but since we're all devs here, I get to do what I like to do and maybe talk about some of the guts of this thing. So this is cool. Like, we got the response back. It is actually very accurate. And what's even more cool is that it sourced this response from a lot of different sources. In our case, Linear, which we use for our bug tracking system. There's a Notion doc here and a Slack conversation even where we discuss the design of this thing. So under the hood, this is the cool part, which is how we get all of this information and context together and how we shape it for the final inference step, because as you can tell, this is an AI-based application. So it starts with source code, and it's super easy to set this up in Unblocked. You just go to data sources and then add one of these integrations here. If it's GitHub, it's super easy. It's the GitHub app install flow. You just install the app, select the repos that you want to ingest, and away it goes. When we ingest the source code, we obviously have to figure out how to relate it semantically to the questions that people ask. So that goes through a process called embeddings. I think probably a lot of people are familiar with this now because AI has been around for a while. But we've vectorized the source code. It's not enough, though, just to take chunks of source code by, say, number of lines or up to the new line and chunk it up that way. That won't produce very good results, because what you really need is to preserve all the semantic context around the source code. So you have to create an abstract syntax tree or a graph, a call graph of some kind. There's other techniques you can use where you decorate the source code itself with comments that describe where this function is being called and why it's being used, for example. When you do that and you create the embeddings, you're encoding that semantic meaning into the source code. So when people ask questions about it, those source chunks can be retrieved accurately and then reconstituted. It's the same for large documents. We found that Markdown tends to be the best format, especially for OpenAI. It varies per model, of course, and we always use the best model for the job. So if users are asking questions that require sourcing from documentation, we're going to usually use OpenAI's models, which are very good at cross-referencing code to documentation. If we're dealing with more of a code-based question, we'll use probably Claude. And that's because Claude is just better at understanding code and generating code. But where Claude tends to fall down is that previous point I made about referencing information across different documents. One of the interesting things about, has anyone played with LLMs? And I'm sure everyone has at this point, but have you played with long context and throwing like tons and tons of stuff into the context window? Yes, no, yeah? What tends to happen is some of the context will get lost. If you are asking a question that requires hopping between many different documentation sources, some of those models won't do a super great job of that. So Claude does an okay job. Gemini, well, it used to do a bad job. I think with the newest models, 2.5 Pro, it's doing an okay job. But OpenAI is still kind of the winner here. Just a couple other things I wanted to point out. So after the response comes back, we generate these sample questions here. What we discovered is that developers know the first question to ask, but then they get a little bit confused about where they can go from there. This is a question of unknown unknowns. They don't know like what the scope of the knowledge space is that they could explore. So we generate these sample questions to help them explore the rest of that knowledge space, basically. At the bottom here, we have this thing that says loop in an expert. These experts are derived at the start of the process. We ingest all of the source code, documentation, and then we create essentially a topology using sort of a recursive algorithm that generates topic clusters and then figures out who belongs in those clusters based on who they work with and what they work on the most. So this source mark engine question turns out that Rasheen, Matt, and Richie are the experts on this. And so if I didn't get enough out of this response and I wanted to include them in the conversation, I could do that. The last thing here is that are these two buttons here, helpful and not helpful. So it turns out that even with AI-driven evaluations, which we definitely do, to reduce things like hallucinations and untruthy content, it's still actually completely impossible to be 100% accurate. And the reason is because some of that institutional knowledge and context lives here. It's not written down anywhere. A lot of organizations still have this problem today, which is fine. You want to move fast and you don't necessarily have time to jot everything down. And so as a result, if you get a response that's not completely right, you can tell us through this downvote thing here, write in your feedback, not helpful, and we will review all of those. Please add a reason that's a little bit better than not helpful so that we can figure out how to make this better for your team. Okay, so that was the web client. Now I'm going to show you our IDE integration. So this is the code. This is the code that I was referring to, the source mark engine. Here on the left, we have these two panels: PR discussions and questions and docs. And what this is actually doing is semantically, it's embedding the source code that you're looking at currently. And you'll notice that as I scroll, the content on the left changes. And that's because it is focused on the meaning of the source code. And so all this stuff on the left there are the documents and conversations that are immediately relevant to the thing that you're looking at. And it's not just based on the direct links between source code and, say, pull requests, because that's definitely doable. It's semantically linked as well. But since it's an AI-driven system, of course, you can ask questions about your source code as well. So I'll do that here. You can just say, what does this do? Now, Unblocked is aware of the code that you're working on, but also the code in proximity to the thing that I just highlighted there. So if you were to ask ChatGPT this question, you dumped just this class in there and said, hey, what does this method do? It would give you a response. That's great. It would probably tell you, more or less how that thing works. But Unblocked goes many steps further than that because we understand not only the context surrounding it, but the best practices for your organization. So I could say, can you write some tests for this? We always say, please. You never know. And then this will come back. When it generates the tests are in line with the way that we write our tests internally because Unblocked is aware of the best practices within our organization. And that's just based on the analysis that it did on the source code ahead of time. The third client is Slack. So Slack is an interesting one because, you know what, I'll do a different question here first. We have this feature called auto response. And auto response is cool because the Unblocked sits kind of passively listening to see if it has something valuable to add. We wouldn't want the bot to reply, if someone was like, hey, what are we going to do for lunch on Tuesday? If Unblocked chimed in on that, it would be sort of annoying. So you can see that it provided a response there and it decided that it did have a valuable response for that question. If you don't want to wait though, because that sometimes can take a little while the evals run, you can just say, hey, Unblocked, show me this. And away it goes. So this question here is interesting because Unblocked can also generate architecture diagrams for you. If you ask it, I asked the question here about how our SAML auth flow works, but you could get it to describe, basically any sort of architecture component in your system, and it'll be able to draw a diagram. Let's see what it comes up with this time. Oh, cool. Oh, that's interesting. It created some cruft over here. But let's see if this is accurate. Yeah, that's pretty good. Nice. Very cool. So that was the 3 clients for Unblocked. I think actually we do have quite a bit of time left, so I can show you some other cool stuff. Going back here, as I described at the start, the team built CI products in the past, so we really just couldn't help ourselves. We had to build something to do with CI. So this what you're looking at here is our new feature that we're calling CI triage. So I added this change that basically checks to see if any of our configurations have a timeout defined that's less than a second. We use HOCON for our configuration, and this is my fault. I forgot to include the S after the number 10. And if anyone here uses HOCON, what that actually does is convert to 10 milliseconds instead of 10 seconds. So my timeouts were 10 milliseconds and it broke a lot of stuff. That's my fault. So I wrote a little test to catch that in the future. But the failure that I got was pretty weird. It was just basically something that said, yeah, something went wrong with your EC2 instance that you're using for your GitHub Actions runner. Great, okay, that's not super useful. But CI triage really helped me in this situation because this problem had been discussed in the past in a Slack conversation. So Unblocked was able to pull in the context of that and even refer to the issue within that Slack conversation, and then give me a recommended fix. So that was awesome, because I could go to the Slack conversation right now and discover what the thing is to do, that I could repair that problem. But if I couldn't do it from there, at least I knew who was involved, right? So I could reach out to that person and get them to help me to fix it. All right. So we still have time, so maybe one more thing. Who has played with Cursor? Yeah. That's interesting. I expected more hands. Has anyone used any of these agentic IDEs outside of the people that said they use Cursor? Yeah? Which ones? Just shout it out. Windsurf? Yeah, Windsurf is cool too. I like Windsurf. So these agentic IDEs are becoming quite popular, because I was really surprised by the level of intelligence that they have. You can do things like refactor code, sort of simple tasks like that, add new fields to data classes, and it will fairly intelligently search your code base, propagate those changes across to all the right places. So I've been very impressed. There are a few places where it falls down, though. It falls down pretty hard when your code base spans across multiple repos, because it can only see what you have open at any given time. It can also fall down if you ask a complex question or a debugging style question where the answer is non-obvious, kind of like the one that I showed you before in that triage example. But I'll give you a sample of a question here, and I'm going to have our MCP server turned off to start with. You can see that this isn't a super expressive error message. It just has that there's a timeout and some file from a storybook thing somewhere. So away goes Cursor, and it's going to have trouble firstly reading these non-existent files, but then you'll see that the thing that it recommends doing is just really not related to the error at all. It wants to modify this main.js file that's completely wrong. Probably would have resulted in some bad code. So I'm going to reject that, and now I'll turn on Unblocked's MCP server, and we can take that for a spin again. So this time, Unblocked's MCP server has a tool that it publishes that claims that it can debug failure messages. So now that Cursor has found that it can't do that, it'll call our MCP tool. Unblocked returns a summary of a Slack conversation where this issue is discussed, and recommends searching for a pull request and a Slack conversation where the fix was proposed. So away goes Cursor again and calls Unblocked's pull request tool, at which point a diff of the pull request is returned. And then it calls the Slack conversation tool and gets the summary of the conversation that took place. So now, with all that extra context, Cursor can really sing and gets very, very close to the root of the problem. And I think it said, would you like some help implementing? Sure, go for it. So let's see what it does here. Found the right file at least, so that's good. This is funny because it's fairly non-deterministic, so I sometimes get a different outcome. Did it do the thing? Yep, that's pretty good. So that was the fix that was discussed, so awesome, we're on our way. All right, I'm going to go back to here. Cool. So we have quite a few people that are using Unblocked today, and they're getting a lot of mileage out of it. And at this point, I think that brings me to the end. So if anyone has any questions, we've got quite a bit of time left, and if we don't use it all, then we get to go and have coffee early. Cool. Anyone? Yeah. Yeah, so we communicate directly with OpenAI's API rather than through an OpenAI app. But yes, so to answer your question directly, we do all of that intelligence stuff ourselves, where we build the documentation set, the knowledge graph, et cetera. And then we handle the question and all the retrieval, and then just basically load the context for the frontier models to do their thing. Yeah. Yeah, certainly. Yeah, the primary concern that people have is around model training. So, well, there's two concerns. That's the primary concern. Unblocked does not train any models with customer data at all. So that's the first important thing. The second thing is just around trust. So, OpenAI has an opt-out training policy. Many of our customers use the Azure variant of OpenAI so that their contract is with Microsoft and they have stronger guarantees for compliance reasons. Even then, some of our customers won't use OpenAI, and so they have agreements with either Bedrock, Amazon Bedrock, where you can get Claude models from there, or they deploy their own, and then we can use those as well. They have to be fairly beefy models, so you could imagine that customers that really have those requirements and need to deploy their own models have a lot of infrastructure to do that, but yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
So you kind of do some processing and you prepare data that you send to the OpenAI API. Like, what kind of data load would that be that you end up sending to the OpenAI?
So the question was, what does the data load and data characteristics look like to what we send to OpenAI? It varies. So the models have, at least for now, a fairly limited context window size of 240,000 tokens, I think. Tokens, if you do the rough translation, is approximately 2.5 bytes per token. So that's kind of like the maximum payload size that we would send at any kind of inference time. But this all happens on Unblocked's backend. It doesn't happen from the clients. So in terms of like load on customer networks, there's none. Yeah, it's just the query that gets sent to the service. Yeah, good question. Yep.
Yeah, thanks. Great talk. Apologies for everyone who cannot hear me. In your example, you started with, it took 5 days to write 12 lines of code.
Yeah.
And the example you used to ask the question is about a very specific piece of code, like explaining this. That makes perfect sense. But can you actually ask a generic question? Like, I don't know, something is wrong to build an UI, displays the wrong value.
Yeah.
Where do I look? Where do I start? Like, have you had any luck kind of asking that type of question, or something very vague?
Yeah, certainly. So the question was, can you ask Unblocked a very vague question? So yes, Unblocked operates in a conversational mode. So you can ask a question like, I'm having a problem with this thing. Unblocked will come back, and if it finds the question too ambiguous, it will suggest some things to help narrow that down. But remember, like, it's a semantic engine. So if you ask about a particular topic area, it's going to narrow down on a few different things, and then where the ambiguity is too wide for it to answer the question confidently, it will ask follow-ups to help narrow it down. Yeah.
I guess kind of following on from that last question, if say you were working on like a library code or something, and you wanted to make sure it didn't have any impact on other services which might be using it, is Unblocked able to sort of go over like the entire code base and tell you, yes, you're using it here and here, and if you make that change, it's likely to make this service. I mean, is it able to sort of go over large code base in that way?
So the question is, does Unblocked span across an entire code base, and can it understand like changes in one micro area of the code base and its impact on other areas? Yeah, definitely yes. Yeah. So it has not just like the semantic relationships, but also the call graph relationships and the AST relationships. So it understands, where code is visited and can resolve like any kind of changes that you make over here, and the impact is over here. It'll figure that out. Yeah. Yep.
Is Unblocked deployed as a service in the cloud, or it will be customers deploy it within their own networks?
Good question. So it is primarily a cloud-hosted service. However, we have customers that have super sensitive security needs where no data can transit outside their network. And so for that, we do have an on-prem solution. Yeah. Yeah, in the back there. The connectors are all developed by us in-house. Yeah, the reason for that is because there are some nuances about how we retrieve the data. Like, for example, Slack is a very complicated interaction model where you have to recurse through the conversations, and sometimes you need to switch tokens depending on which conversation you're in. So for example, the app level token is not sufficient to read private conversations, as an example. Speaking of private conversations, by the way, I will caveat all of this by saying that Unblocked has a really strong data source access model. So we flow up all of the data access permissions from all the integration sources. Meaning, if you can't access repository A, but you can see repository B, then when you ask a question from Unblocked, you won't get an answer that uses the information from repository A if you don't have permission to see it. And it's the same thing for Slack. If you're not in a private conversation, then you can't, Unblocked won't use that information in its answers. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yes, in the back. Yeah, we get that question a lot. So you could actually use Unblocked for this purpose, definitely. In fact, let's see if I can give you a kind of a preview of what that would look like. So go back to change the display mode again. I'm sorry. 1 second. Yeah. So in this area here, we have this concept of data presets. And if I wanted to create one, I can basically select which data sources are being used. And then when I ask a new question, so I've got these presets here that has engineering content or Slack only content, and I could make it so it's Notion only content, or even dive deeper than that and select like particular Confluence spaces, for example. Okay. So if I wanted to set something up for a support team, either is in a Slack channel, for example, supporting either like DevOps support, or if I had a sales team that was working, engineering sales team, I should say, because I like to keep things engineering focused, then I could just have the Confluence spaces assigned to that. And then when I go and ask a new question, I can go into preferences and just use one of those data presets. And then Unblocked will only answer the question using that particular piece of data. So that's how you would achieve the thing I think you're asking currently in Unblocked. Make sense? Anyone else? Coffee time? Awesome. Thank you.